Pack your things, he said, like he was reading a weather report. By tonight. The boardroom air felt stale, screensaver blues drifting across a wall of glass. I stepped into the stairwell for privacy. Metal door, soft close, then the hum of the city rising through the slit of a window. On my phone, Evan's breath barely fogged the line, steady, pleased with himself. You're still there, he prodded. Mara? A long second. I'm here. I've accepted an offer, he went on, almost gentle. The apartment. We close fast. You'll be fine. The pause I gave him was not empty. It was inventory, the angle of his voice when he thinks he's untouchable, the faint echo that told me he was calling from our kitchen, and the way he left out the one word that mattered, ours. The building lights flickered across my wristwatch. In the stairwell's cold light, my reflection was a suggestion more than a face. You sold my home, I said quietly. On his end, a soft laugh. Don't make this difficult. Serena and I. He stopped there, testing the name like a key in a future he'd already measured. A future where I was politely removed. It was the certainty that drew a small, precise heat up my spine. I didn't answer right away. Above me, footsteps crossed a landing, heels, impatient, moving on. Even the building seemed to keep going without me. Evan, I said, where will you put the piano? A beat. He hated that instrument, called it a monument to silence. They'll probably want it gone, he said. We can arrange. No, I said. We can't. I could almost see him reaching for that old swagger, the muscle memory of a man who believes paperwork is merely a rumor. Listen, he said, softening, I tried to be decent. You get time. A graceful exit. There's a deposit already, so let's not. A car horn flared 7 floors below. I watched a bus fold itself into a turn like a large animal deciding where to sleep. The city felt distant and precise, it always has, when something is ending. My fingertips were calm against the phone. It's a co-op, Evan, I murmured. They don't move on speed. They move on approval. And signatures. He exhaled through his nose, light and practiced, as if I were a student interrupting his seminar. I assumed you'd be reasonable. I am, I said. Very. The stairwell sensor light clicked off, leaving me in an even gray. I didn't turn it back on. It was easier to hear him in the half-dark, the way triumph thins out when it has to stand alone. Somewhere in our apartment, if he was truly there, a cabinet door eased shut. He had always underestimated the acoustics of consequence. By tonight, he repeated. I don't want a scene. I pictured the foyer, the brass mail slots, the porter who notices everything, the mirror that makes you consider who you are before it lets you in. I thought about the piano's lid, heavy and patient, and the document tucked where dust does not dare, ink not yet dry when we last refinanced. Then don't make one, I said, and ended the call before he could try on sympathy. Back in the boardroom, the conversation resumed without me. Someone was making a joke about projections. Someone else was nodding too hard. I sat, folded the phone face down, and let the silence inside me turn into shape. Not anger. Not panic. A line of thought, clear as a razor laid flat. They believed I would leave quietly. They believed speed would beat scrutiny. They believed what they'd been told about me. What they didn't know was already in motion. They thought they'd won the hour, they hadn't even seen the clock I set. The city never felt louder than that evening. Every voice on the train sounded like it belonged to someone moving forward, plans, dates, destinations. I sat among them, still but listening, like the pause between a question and its answer. The message from Evan came minutes before the train surfaced downtown. You'll get the official notice tomorrow. Let's keep this civil. Civility. That was his favorite disguise, the word he wrapped around cruelty to make it palatable. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't touch the eyes, and slipped the phone into my coat pocket. Outside, the air was cold enough to clarify thought. Streetlights threw long gold lines over wet pavement. I walked 3 blocks to my office. It's empty now, save for the faint hum of the air system and the single desk lamp I'd left burning like a lighthouse for nights like this. My reflection in the glass wall of the conference room was steady. My pulse wasn't. I sat, opened my laptop, and began searching through folders, not for memories, but for evidence. The refinancing documents. The deed transfer. The emails Evan had skimmed without reading because I'd made them sound dull, domestic, harmless. When I found the file, my throat tightened, not from fear, but from the strange, electric calm that comes when truth turns into proof. My name. My signature. My property. He had no idea. For months, I'd been quietly cleaning up the wreckage he didn't know he'd left behind. Every time he handled something, I checked it twice. Every time he talked over me in meetings about a partnership, I watched the way people's eyes flickered, the way they saw him, not me. And I learned something: people like Evan don't fear confrontation. They fear quiet competence. I sent 2 emails, one to my lawyer, one to the co-op board. Both factual, precise, devoid of anger. I didn't need emotion to make the knife sharp. When the messages were sent, I leaned back and let the silence fill the room. That's when I noticed the piano app on my phone, a small thing I used for pitch training. I pressed a single note, soft and pure. It rang through the still air like a confession no one asked for. I wasn't angry at Evan. Not anymore. I was curious to see how a man who built his life on shortcuts would react when every door he thought he'd closed was still open behind him. The sound of that note faded slowly, swallowed by the hum of the lights. Outside, a taxi horn echoed up the street, long, mournful, and final. Tomorrow, the paperwork would land in his inbox. Tomorrow, the first thread of his illusion would come loose. He believed this was a divorce. He still didn't understand it was a reckoning. By morning, he'd realized the sale he bragged about never existed, and that was only the beginning. The next morning arrived with a sky the color of unfinished steel. Rain pressed against my window, not hard, but steady, like a reminder that nothing ever stops falling, only changing shape. When my phone buzzed, I didn't need to check who it was. Evan never waited for the world to reach him, he demanded an audience. "I just got an email from your lawyer," he said, his voice tight. "What the hell is this about ownership?" I took a sip of coffee, let the warmth coat my throat before answering. "It's about accuracy," I said evenly. "You claimed you sold an apartment you don't own." A pause. The kind that stretches when someone realizes their reflection doesn't match the story they've been telling. "Don't start playing games, Mara," he snapped. "We both know." "Do we?" I interrupted, quietly. "Because the deed disagrees." He started to speak, then stopped. I heard the faint sound of paper shuffling, the panic of a man looking for proof that never existed. That silence was the first real honesty I'd heard from him in months. "You forged something," he said finally, desperate. "You had to. This isn't right." I smiled to myself. "You signed it, Evan. You just didn't read it. That's not forgery. That's negligence." There was a sharp exhale, that telltale tremor of disbelief that came when his confidence began to rot. He'd spent years thinking control meant talking louder. Now he was realizing it had always meant listening first. "You can't win this," he said, but the edge was gone from his voice. "You're not." "Not what?" I asked. "Not ruthless enough," he muttered. I looked out at the rain tracing lines down the glass, slow, deliberate, unbothered. "Maybe not," I said. "But I don't need to be ruthless. I just need to be thorough." He hung up. For a moment, I let the quiet settle, a new kind of quiet, heavy with the sound of something collapsing out of view. Then I forwarded the call log to my lawyer, attaching a short note. "He's realized. Proceed with the letter." The letter wasn't for him, not really. It was for the buyer, the person who thought they'd purchased my apartment from a man with nothing to sell. It explained, in clean legal language, that the sale was void, the funds at risk, and the agent complicit if they didn't withdraw immediately. A paper storm was beginning, and every sheet of it bore my name at the top. That evening, I took a slow walk through the apartment, the one Evan thought he'd sold. The scent of sandalwood still lingered in the hallway. The framed photos on the shelf caught glints of gold light. I ran my fingertips along the piano lid, tracing the dustless curve. It was still mine, all of it. The phone lit up again, another message from him. Short. Unfiltered. You won't get away with this. I smiled faintly. He still didn't understand. This wasn't about getting away. It was about being seen, finally, fully, for what he had never imagined I could be. Tomorrow, he'd try to fight back. And that's exactly what I was waiting for. He showed up before sunset. I heard the elevator chime, that sharp, metallic note that always echoed down the hallway before the doors opened. Then came his footsteps, heavy, uneven, impatient. The sound of a man used to being welcomed, now walking into uncertainty. I didn't move at first. I let him knock twice before opening the door. Evan stood there, rain on his coat, jaw tight enough to crack. His tie was gone, his shirt clung to his chest like he'd run the last block. Behind him, the city lights bled through the corridor windows, fractured reflections, like glass remembering how it broke. Are you enjoying yourself? He said, voice low and shaking. You think this is funny? I stepped aside calmly. Come in, before you embarrass yourself further. He brushed past me without answering, the smell of cold air and ego trailing in behind him. The apartment was immaculate, every surface clean, every trace of him gone. He noticed. His eyes flickered to the empty spaces where his things had been. You started without me, he muttered. I had help, I said. Professional help. He turned, jaw tight. You really called lawyers? You're that vindictive? Vindictive implies emotion, I said, my voice level. This is procedural. He laughed, short, humorless. You can't just erase me. I don't have to, I replied. You've been erasing yourself for years. For a moment, he didn't speak. His reflection stared back from the dark piano lid, distorted by its curve. Then he moved closer, too close, the kind of closeness meant to intimidate. It used to work. Not anymore. You don't get it, he said, voice breaking slightly. That money was everything I had. Serena and I made plans, I finished for him. Yes. I've heard. I imagine she's not thrilled about finding out your everything was borrowed. His eyes flashed. You think you're better than me? No, I said, looking him in the eye. Just quieter. He stepped back, the fight draining from him like water through a crack. That was always how it went with Evan, the moment control slipped from his grasp, he'd lose interest in holding on at all. I'll fix this, he said finally, almost to himself. I'll figure it out. You can start, I said, walking to the counter and sliding a folder across the surface. By reading. Carefully, this time. He looked down at the papers, the formal notice from the buyer's lawyer, the voided sale declaration, the refund demand. Each line another reminder of how completely he'd miscalculated. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the first page. You're ruining me. I shook my head slowly. You did that on your own. I'm just turning on the lights. For a long moment, the only sound was the steady rain against the window. Then he closed the folder, his face pale. This isn't over, he said. It is, I replied. You just haven't caught up yet. He stood there, drenched in a silence he didn't know how to fill. I saw it then, the smallest flicker of realization in his eyes. He wasn't the one driving the story anymore. He was just in it. When he finally walked out, he didn't slam the door. He didn't have the right kind of strength left for that. I locked it behind him, the click soft but absolute. And for the first time in years, the apartment exhaled. He thought that was the end of it, but the real unraveling hadn't even begun. The morning after he left, the city felt sharper. Even the air outside the apartment seemed to move differently, cleaner somehow, as if the walls themselves had waited for his absence to start breathing again. I poured coffee, sat by the window, and watched the street below, people rushing toward lives that didn't hinge on deceit. There was something peaceful in that anonymity. My phone buzzed before 8. It was Chloe, my lawyer and, in another life, my roommate from university. Her voice carried that steady current I'd always trusted, professional, calm, faintly amused. "He's already called 3 times, she said. 2 voicemails, 1 email, all dramatic. He's claiming you set him up." I smiled. Good. It means he's still in denial. Denial slows the damage. "We're sending the formal divorce draft today," she continued. "Everything's positioned exactly how we discussed. Once he sees the financials, he'll realize he doesn't have room to fight." "I want it airtight," I said. "He'll look for an angle." "He can look," she replied dryly. "But angles require leverage. He doesn't have any." After the call, I let her words sit in the quiet. No leverage. That was a sentence I'd waited years to hear. I spent the next few hours at the firm, surrounded by the low hum of fluorescent light and the smell of old coffee, the usual soundtrack of weekday survival. But beneath the routine, there was an undertow. I could feel it. Whispers traveling just fast enough to reach me in fragments. Apparently, Evan had already begun making calls of his own. Not to me, to anyone who might listen. His colleagues, his broker, even a mutual friend or two. His story was shifting by the hour, each version tailored to make him sound more victim than villain. But the truth, I knew, had one advantage over lies: it didn't require rehearsal. Around noon, I received a message from a client who had also worked with Evan's company. A short text, politely phrased. "Is everything all right between you two?" I heard some conflicting things. I typed back carefully. "Everything's fine. Just making corrections to a few misunderstandings." It was all I needed to say. People in our circle understood tone better than detail. Calm, concise, confident, that's what they remembered. By the end of the day, I'd received 3 more similar messages. The current was turning, and I didn't have to touch the water to guide it. That evening, as I left the office, the city was wrapped in gold dusk, the kind that makes glass look liquid. I walked past a storefront and caught my reflection. Same face. Different presence. This wasn't vengeance anymore. It was reclamation, quiet, precise, irreversible. And though I'd told Chloe everything was under control, I knew something deeper was stirring beneath the surface. Because men like Evan don't fall cleanly. They drag everything they can down with them. That night, he called again, but this time, it wasn't to fight. It was to beg. The call came just after midnight. 3 rings, then silence. Then again, 3 more. Persistent, not angry. Desperate. I let it ring twice more before answering. Evan. He didn't speak right away. I could hear him breathing, shallow, unsteady. The sound of someone realizing the walls aren't just closing in, they're locked from the outside. "You have to listen to me," he said finally. His voice was different, low, stripped of its polish. "This is getting out of hand." I leaned against the window frame, looking down at the empty street below. The street lamps painted long shadows over the asphalt, thin as veins. "What exactly is out of hand, Evan?" "The truth? The buyer's threatening legal action," he blurted. "They're saying I misrepresented ownership. I'm going to lose everything if..." "If?" I asked. He swallowed audibly. "If you don't intervene. Just tell them this was a misunderstanding. We can fix this, Mara. Please." The irony almost made me laugh. The same man who once mocked my caution, who said I overthought everything, was now asking me to fix his carelessness. "I'm afraid I can't," I said softly. I told the truth. What they do with it isn't my problem. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. They've frozen my accounts. The down payment, it's gone. I have bills, clients, Serena. Serena, I repeated, tasting the name like a foreign word. How is she handling her investment? There was a pause. A long one. The kind that says more than an argument ever could. She left, he said quietly. She found out. She said she won't be part of a scandal. Smart of her, I said. You taught her what happens when you bet on arrogance. He didn't reply. The silence on the line was raw, uneven. I imagined him sitting in our old living room, the one he once called his, surrounded by half-packed boxes and unpaid promises. Evan, I said, my voice calm but measured, when you made that call in the hallway last week, when you told me you were divorcing me, did it feel powerful? I don't know, he whispered. I thought it was time. It was, I said. You just didn't realize what kind of ending you were writing. He sighed, broken. You're really going to let me fall like this? I'm not letting you fall, I said, eyes fixed on the quiet city below. I'm letting gravity finish what you started. There was nothing left for him to say. Eventually, the line went dead. For a long time, I stood there in the darkness, watching the rain trace silver paths down the glass. I wasn't proud. I wasn't vindicated. I was simply free. Because that's the thing about betrayal, it's not the breaking that defines you. It's what you build after. The next morning, I sent a single message to Chloe. He's admitted fault. Move forward. No ceremony. No bitterness. Just momentum. And as I slid my phone face down on the counter, I realized something simple and irrevocable. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was leading. By the end of that week, Evan wouldn't just lose the apartment, he'd lose everything that once made him believe he was untouchable. By Thursday, the calls had stopped. Not because he'd given up, because he'd finally realized that pleading was another form of noise, and I'd stopped hearing it. The world around him, though, had begun to listen. It started small. A missed meeting at his firm. A rumor whispered over coffee by someone who heard he'd been caught up in something messy. By the end of the day, that whisper had grown legs. People like Evan thrived on image, reputation was his currency, his shield. But the same way a lie travels fast, silence travels deeper. When I refused to defend him, people began to fill in the blanks themselves. And they always fill them with something worse than the truth. That afternoon, Chloe sent me an update. His firm's compliance team reached out, she said. Apparently, they've discovered some irregularities in his client records. Your situation might have triggered a review. Good, I said quietly. It's about time someone read what he signed. She hesitated. You knew this might happen. I did, I said. That's why I waited. People don't see the pattern until you stop interrupting it. After the call, I took a long walk through the city. It was one of those early evenings where the light seemed to linger just for you, soft, amber, forgiving. The kind of light that makes even a skyline look like it's healing. I passed the cafe where Evan used to take client meetings, always too loud, always performing success. Now, two of his colleagues sat there without him, one scrolling through emails, the other shaking his head. Their voices carried just enough for me to hear fragments. Can you believe he thought he could sell? She's handling it like a pro. Doesn't even sound angry. They didn't notice me. They didn't need to. That's the thing about power, when it's quiet, it moves differently. It doesn't announce itself, it simply arrives, and suddenly everyone realizes it's already been there. By the time I returned home, the apartment felt brighter. Not cleaner, not emptier, lighter. As if the air itself was done keeping secrets. I poured a glass of wine and sat at the piano. My fingers hovered over the keys. I didn't play, I just listened. To the quiet. To the weightlessness. To the calm that comes when someone else's chaos finally stops touching you. Then, my phone vibrated once more. A new message, not from Evan this time, but from someone I hadn't heard from in years. I heard about what happened. You always were smarter than he gave you credit for. Coffee? An old friend. Someone who'd once told me, long ago, that silence could be a strategy. I smiled, setting the phone aside. Not yet, I thought. There was still one last movement to this symphony, and I hadn't played my final note. Because while Evan's world was collapsing, he still hadn't learned why. He thought it was about the apartment. He thought it was about revenge. He still didn't understand, this was never about punishment. It was about correction. By the time he realized the full truth, the damage would already be public and irreversible. It began on a Friday, endings often do. By mid-morning, Evan's name was circulating quietly through inboxes across his firm. Not shouted, not announced. Whispered. The kind of whisper that turns into a verdict long before anyone opens their mouth. Chloe called first. You might want to sit down, she said. I am, I replied. They've suspended him. Internal audit. Apparently, the sale you voided led them to cross-check several of his files. Turns out, your apartment wasn't the only oversight. I let that sink in, not with satisfaction, but with the stillness of inevitability. Evan had always moved fast. Too fast to read fine print. Too fast to care about boundaries. Now the speed that once protected him was eating him alive. What happens next? I asked. Officially? They'll investigate. Unofficially? She exhaled. He's done. No firm wants that liability. Outside my office window, the sky was shifting, streaks of silver between clouds. The city below carried on like nothing had changed, but I could feel the invisible weight shifting. The balance restoring itself. By noon, my inbox began to fill, discreet messages from mutual acquaintances, all written in the same careful tone. I'm so sorry you had to deal with all this. You've handled it with so much grace. I always wondered how you managed to stay so calm. Calm. They always noticed it at the end. No one pays attention to composure until it becomes the loudest thing in the room. Later that afternoon, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. No greeting, no signature, just a single sentence. He's blaming you. Of course he was. It's easier to point at the person holding the mirror than to face what's in it. That evening, I walked home instead of taking a cab. The sidewalks glistened from a light drizzle, and every street lamp reflected like melted gold on the pavement. I passed strangers laughing, couples rushing for cover, the city breathing in rhythm. When I reached my building, the doorman greeted me with a quiet nod. He didn't ask questions, he never did. But I could tell he'd heard something too. The world has its ways of carrying stories upward. Inside, I lit a single candle on the counter, a habit I'd picked up lately. A ritual for peace, not prayer. The flame flickered, steady but alive. For the first time in a long time, I felt like the noise had left the room for good. I didn't want him destroyed. I wanted him exposed, so that, finally, his reflection matched the truth. And that truth was out now. Still, something told me it wasn't over. People like Evan don't surrender quietly. They try to rebuild, not with humility, but with desperation. And desperation, I've learned, is always louder the second time around. When he showed up again, uninvited, unsteady, and desperate, I realized he wasn't just fighting to save face. He was fighting to rewrite the ending. The knock came just after dusk. Not loud. Not urgent. Just steady, 3 measured raps that carried the weight of someone pretending to be composed. I knew it was him before I opened the door. Evan stood there in the hallway, dressed in the same arrogance he used to wear like armor, but it didn't fit anymore. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loose, his expression hovering between defiance and defeat. Behind him, the light from the corridor buzzed faintly, flickering against the tension in the air. I need to talk, he said. You've done enough talking, I replied, but stepped aside anyway. 5 minutes. He walked in slowly, scanning the apartment like it was a crime scene, which, in a way, it was. Not because of blood, but because of truth. Everything that had once belonged to him, the glass table, the framed photographs, the carefully chosen rug, had either been moved or replaced. The space no longer carried his reflection. "I heard you've been busy," I said quietly. He turned sharply. "You think this is funny? You cost me my job, my reputation." "No," I interrupted. "You did that yourself. I just stopped shielding you from the consequences." His jaw tightened. "You could have warned me." "I did," I said. "You just didn't like the language I used." He exhaled, pacing near the window. "You don't understand what you've done. I built everything from nothing, and you signed it all away," I finished, folding my arms. "Every signature you ignored, every clause you didn't bother to read. You built a house on air, Evan." I just opened the window. For a moment, he looked at me, really looked. There was no hate in his eyes now, just confusion. The dawning realization that he'd underestimated not my temper, but my patience. "I didn't think you were capable of this," he said softly. I tilted my head. "Of what? Protecting what's mine? Or no longer asking for permission to do it?" He didn't answer. His reflection shimmered faintly in the piano's black surface, warped, trembling. "I can fix it," he said suddenly. If we could start over, I could make this right." I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Evan," I said, my tone even, "you don't start over by pretending nothing happened. You start over by admitting it did." He turned away, shoulders sagging. The silence between us felt heavy, thick with all the years of pretending. Then, almost to himself, he muttered, "You were supposed to need me." I took a step closer, my voice calm but final. "That was your first mistake." He looked back at me, eyes glassy, and for the briefest moment, I saw it, not guilt, not regret, but recognition. The look of a man seeing the version of me he'd spent years denying. The quiet stretched again, this time more fragile than tense. "Goodbye, Evan," I said. He hesitated, like he wanted to argue, but there was nothing left to win. Finally, he nodded, not in acceptance, but in defeat, and walked out. No slammed doors. No final threats. Just the soft sound of footsteps fading down the hall. When the latch clicked, I closed my eyes and let the silence settle like dust on a closed book. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was balance. But I should have known, people like Evan don't disappear quietly. The real reckoning came the next morning, and it didn't knock. The morning started like any other, quiet, deliberate, composed. Coffee. Email. The gentle hum of normalcy that comes when you believe the storm has finally passed. Then my phone buzzed. Not a call, a notification. News alert. I didn't have to open it to know his name would be there. Financial advisor under investigation for fraudulent property transactions. The headline sat like a confession in bold type. His photo beneath it, that same practiced smile, eyes too bright, suit too perfect, now looked like a mask he'd forgotten to take off. I read the article once, carefully. Every detail precise, factual, verifiable. It mentioned the apartment sale, the investigation, the internal audit that had exposed discrepancies in multiple client accounts. There was no mention of me. There didn't need to be. The truth had no fingerprints. I closed my laptop, exhaled slowly, and felt something I hadn't in years, peace without guilt. A few hours later, Chloe called. "You saw it?" she asked. I did. They're calling it professional misconduct. He might lose his license. I'm not surprised, I said. He built everything on borrowed certainty. He'll try to reach you, she warned. He'll want to spin it as your fault. Don't engage. I smiled faintly. I won't need to. Because by then, I already knew he wouldn't be calling. Not after what came next. That evening, the building's doorman handed me a letter. No return address, just my name written in the same handwriting that once signed joint tax forms and anniversary cards. Inside was a single page. No apology. No explanation. Just one line. You win. And for the first time, I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Because this was never about winning. It was about balance. About truth finding its way, quietly but relentlessly, like water seeping through cracks until it becomes the landscape. I folded the note and set it on the counter beside my piano. The candle beside it flickered once, as if acknowledging an ending. When I sat at the piano that night, my hands didn't shake. The first note was steady, low, resonant, certain. It wasn't triumph I was playing. It was closure. Through the window, the city glowed, indifferent, endless, alive. People were still moving, still chasing, still falling for the illusion that power comes from noise. But I knew better now. Power was silence. Power was patience. Power was letting truth arrive on its own schedule. And it had. I thought the story ended there, until I learned what Evan did next. And that final revelation changed everything. I found out 2 days later. It came not from Chloe, not from the news, but from a neighbor who stopped me in the lobby, her voice low, uncertain. "Did you hear about Evan?" she asked. "They said there was an accident." I didn't answer right away. I just watched the rain slide down the glass door behind her, steady and endless. "An accident?" I said finally. She nodded. "His car. Late at night. Out past the river road." She hesitated, then added, softer, "They said he was alone." For a moment, the world narrowed, the sound of her voice fading beneath the rush of blood in my ears. Not grief exactly, but something quieter. Something I didn't have a name for. "Thank you," I said, because it was all I could manage. When she left, I stood there in the lobby, surrounded by the faint hum of the building. The same place where all of this began. The marble floor gleamed beneath the light, and for a second, it felt like standing inside a memory I'd already outgrown. I went upstairs without speaking to anyone else. The apartment was still, not heavy, not haunted, just still. The kind of stillness that asks you to listen. I sat at the piano again, fingertips resting on the keys. I didn't play. I just traced them lightly, remembering the first time I'd bought it, before the fights, before the distance, before the betrayals had names. Evan had once joked that the piano was too quiet to be useful. He never understood that silence isn't emptiness, it's potential. I thought about calling Chloe, but what would I even say? That the story had finally closed itself? That the man who tried to erase me had, in the end, erased himself? No. That wasn't what this was about anymore. He hadn't died because of me, he'd died in the shadow of his own choices, chasing control until there was nothing left to hold on to. Outside, the city lights blurred through the rain. Each drop caught a reflection, brief, bright, gone. And somewhere beneath that endless rhythm, I understood the truth I'd been circling all along. Revenge isn't power. Clarity is. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window until the candle burned low. The apartment felt warm, alive, and not because he was gone, but because I finally was here. The life I had now wasn't the one I'd planned. It was better. Quieter. Mine. But before I could let it rest, there was one final thing I needed to do, one last act to reclaim not just what he'd taken, but what I'd forgotten I deserved. A week later, I went back to the river road. The place where it happened. It wasn't morbid curiosity, I just needed to see it once. To understand where his story had finally stopped running. The sky was pale that morning, washed in winter light. The guardrail along the curve still bore the faint scar of impact, scraped metal, a single dent. The river below moved slowly, dark and indifferent, carrying nothing but its own reflection. I stood there for a long time, my breath visible in the cold. There were no flowers, no notes, no candles, just silence. And for the first time, it felt like the right ending. Evan had lived his life in noise, constant motion, constant justification, always trying to outrun the truth that was catching up to him. He'd spent years trying to define me through his failures, his projections, his fear. But here, beside the water, I understood something simple and irrevocable. You don't win by outshouting someone. You win by outlasting the noise. When I left the riverbank, I didn't look back. Some stories don't need monuments. They just need distance. Back home, I opened the piano again. The light from the window fell across the keys like an old friend. I played, not to mourn, not to celebrate, but to remember the rhythm of peace. Each note felt clean, honest, final. Afterward, I poured tea instead of wine and sat by the window. The city moved on beneath me, cars, laughter, the hum of life. And I smiled, not at what I'd lost, but at what I'd rebuilt. In the end, Evan didn't ruin me. He revealed me. He showed me the strength that comes from silence, the dignity of composure, the kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself to exist. The world would keep turning. People would talk. And I finally, had nothing left to prove. I reached for the candle, lighting it once more. The flame danced quietly, reflected in the piano's polished black surface, a single light in a room that no longer held shadows. I whispered, almost to myself. Sometimes silence is the loudest revenge. And I meant it. He called to tell me he sold my home, but what happened next made him lose everything.